starting off. All right. Today is February 23rd, 2010. This is the second interview with Sallie Ann Harrison. We are at Pugh Hall at the University of Florida, and the interview is being conducted by myself, Jessica Lancia, and Dr. Trysh Travis. So thank you for joining us again. And the first question I guess we'll start off with is, when you think about feminism as a term that developed really around the time that you were involved in all of this movement that was going on, what does that mean to you? Are there different kinds of feminisms, and do you belong to a particular one, or is this all sort of an interconnected concept? Could you speak a little bit to that?
Well, at first blush, feminism has to do with equality of the sexes, and the empowerment of women as equal to. And that is a fairly generic definition that most people can work inside and say, I'm not a feminist, but my daughter should make as much money on the assembly line as my son, those kind of things. So, and you can have an intellectual appreciation of feminism and feminist theory. But with anything, the difference between theory and application is life-changing. As in anything, walking the talk is transformative. There were things I believed in my head when I was 21 and 2 years old that I really, from an intellectual perspective, right when I got married on my honeymoon, there was a women's march for equality on August 26th to coincide with the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, it would have been 50 years celebration of that. Well, where I was, of course, I totally empathized with the struggle. And the guy I married said, well, what do you think about that? I said, I think if I wasn't married to you, I would be out there. I would be in New York marching and demonstrating. So that having a belief in itself will not get you in trouble. How you integrate the belief can certainly get you in trouble if you're in love with a belief that engenders social change. You're going to rock the boat if you really believe that the boat has to rock because the world needs to change. In college, I wanted to change the world. Most of my classmates wanted to change the world. It was the 60s. Now, later, when I'm being slapped and spat upon and having beer poured on my head in the civil rights movement, I thought, now this is a crock. How did this happen? Oh, this is because there's movement. It's really healthy that there's this kind of movement, especially if you can escape from some of the movement. But integrating it, the more you integrate it, the more radical, which radical is going back to the root cause that it is. And radical changes affect how we live and with whom we live and where we live. So I'm a radical feminist because to me, for me, the more I can integrate the beloved concept of feminism into myself as a person, the more it appears to be radical.
So this is different than being a liberal feminist or a cultural feminist to you. In what ways?
In what ways?
And do these other terms, liberal feminist and cultural feminist, mean something to you, or are they just throwback terms?
Well, a liberal feminist is still a little more top-heavy from an intellectual perspective. The liberal feminism, my question would be, how much do you believe this? You know, how has this changed your life? And how have you, what are you doing to further your belief system? And the same with cultural feminism. Cultural feminism, if to me, is part of a movement, but not with the deep thought. Yes, it's one thing maybe to wear overalls and hang out in the bookstore. Yeah, however, I'm not trying to be funny.
I know, but that is really perfect.
In the bookstore. But how are we going to stop rape? How are we going to have parity for women? You know, how are we going to make the world safer? For me, as a wife who does not want to be battered by my husband, who the cops will collude with, you know, none of the buttons on your overalls are going to help me live.
So it's a practical element. Radical feminism differs from other feminisms in that it's the practical application of feminism.
Yeah, feet on the ground. Feet on the ground. And when many years ago, when I was in women's movement training school, this woman, Leslie Fiedler, Margaret Fiedler, who was married to a sociologist, Leslie Fiedler, I said, well, she conducted a workshop called How to Keep Love from Turning into Hate. Well, I missed that workshop. I was busy with my own workshop. And I said, gosh, I'm really sorry that I missed your workshop. Can you tell me how to keep love from turning into hate? And she said, yes. You must do everything you ever did completely differently. And then there will not be the anger. There will not be the resentment. You know, there will not be the sorrow for what was not expressed. So think of what your parents did and think about the areas of their lives that were not realized, that were not actualized. And you have to be the adult who's willing to be the person that your parents couldn't be. She said, male and female. So that was good advice. That was really good advice. And I looked at my parents from a political perspective, and with what they had on their plates in a fairly hostile culture, and had a lot of empathy and compassion for them. And another thing I had learned from Rita Mae Brown is, she said, the hidden assumptions will destroy the group every time. It's never the things that are said in a group that destroy it. it's the things that aren't said in a group. And a group can be, to me, a family, a partnership. But what is it I'm not saying that I'll look back and say we didn't talk about? And from a radical perspective, the silences that we know not to collude with. An example of that, a charged one, is that when my daughter was young, around 9, she and her friends used to parade around without their clothes on. And then my ex-husband moved back to town, and I went over to their house one night, and Joan, my daughter, was parading around, didn't have her clothes on. I said, Joan, you got to wear your clothes. This is because now is a time where you are changing. And you're going through the transition from small child to prepubescent. And this is when the world changed and you got to put clothes on. And so later we talked about it, and she said, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid my father will rape me? And I said, I don't know that that's what I'm afraid of. Though certainly when she said that, that was like a sock in the gut. I said, but what I know is that men are wired differently. And seeing you running around, I'm thinking this is a child running around without the clothes on. But that can cause a state of arousal in men. Now, and we're not going to have incest in this family. That's one psychological damage that's not going to happen on my watch. And I told Lewis that too. And that's going deep into the root of things, because I know how women are so frightened, and it's hard to summon the courage to say what is happening, what could start happening, what could be going on. So that's those would be the hidden assumptions that would destroy the group if I chose to look away, or because of my own discomfort, minimized it or doubted myself and say, well, you're just making innocent things look different. I thought, no, as an activist, I know that I don't expect this child, she's not old enough to drive emotionally. And, it's up to me as a mother and as a feminist to advocate for this child's interest and to let her father know this is where we change. We are at a juncture where we change. That's, I hope, an example of integrating feminism. To me, it's reasonable. You'd protect your child, but it would look at more radical to other people. Does that make sense?
So yeah, it does. When you think about your sort of your trajectory through life in a way, how did this radicalization take place? You talk about the civil rights past of your parents and even of your own involvement in it, but when you think about it in terms of the feminist movement and being in a place where you're telling your husband that if you you would be part of that too, then being, radical raving Sallie Ann Harrison,
Oh, yes.
And toting a gun, in a collective. How did that process take place, and what were the major influences in that?
There was major, for me, substantive cultural conflict that I can remember from the time I was 5, and I saw the world differently. I didn't change my view of the world because I saw it differently. I knew what I believed, and that wasn't going to change. I may have mentioned before when my grandmother, who I loved, the woman was a bodhisattva right up there with the Dalai Lama. But when she's singing, I cherish the old rugged cross, I cherish the old instrument of torture, I said, I don't love the old rugged cross. It killed Jesus. And I don't love it. I hate it. Well, she got really upset. Don't say that, honey. Don't say that. So that to me was reasonable. That's logical. Here, let's go kiss the axe that chopped your mother's head off. Huh? That's some sick garbage. I knew that. I knew that. And,
So you were born radical?
you could draw that conclusion.
I'm sure many have.
Well,
Born to be bad?
yeah. I wouldn't have framed it that way, but it could look like that, on the surface and below the surface as well. So, yeah, but you can see how if the world does not make sense and there were just practices that were offensive to me, this would just go on and on.
In that, I support the born to be bad theory, but I wonder if you could say whether there were any particular books you read along the way that were sort of aha moments for you? Or was it not reading that was transformative, but just experience?
Reading made some difference. I will say that, really, as a 7-year-old, Hans Christian Andersen and The Ugly Duckling was more transformative than Louisa May Alcott and Little Women. I kept looking more, but I thought none of these has the ending I really want to see. Mm-hmm. I mean, all the women end up, Jo's got more freedom, but she's got more programs and services to do. I mean, I don't see her art. She's not leading the revolution. And I think she's got Fritz's 4 sons or more to raise. So, the idea of a strong spirit being drowned in programs and services didn't appeal to me. And of course, there weren't the role models enough out there. And, this was at a particularly unflattering and unattractive time in history, the late 50s, I don't know how my dog lived through that. And after a point, she didn't. Next question.
How about later reading, like when you were in college? You were living through a moment where there's an outpouring of really key feminist texts that are still classics in the canon: The Second Sex, Sexual Politics, Against Our Will.
Now they came, Against Our Will came right around 75 or so, mm-hmm. And when I was teaching at Mississippi Valley State University, I taught sociology and psychology to high school students who were going to be on campus with Upward Bound for the summer, first time they'd ever been to college, for the summer to see if it could be demystified and if that's something they'd be willing to do. And a lot of these kids, not surprisingly, had never had a white teacher. Mm-hmm. My husband had he could order whatever books he wanted. Well, which told me I could order whatever books I wanted him to have. And there was one textbook called Juxtaposition, and there are these treatises by Shirley Chisholm and women This is very, right in there, 72, 73. Angela Davis, that were very exciting for me. And, and that is when I was still in Mississippi, when I was 21 and 22. I thought, yes, it has to be this way. How we have to be here, how we move. Thinking, I'm surrounded by cotton fields and the Delta. How do we get there? But the voices of Shirley Chisholm and probably Germaine Greer as well. And that was early. And then I moved to Gainesville. Worked in the McGovern campaign when I was pregnant, and then at the end of the McGovern campaign, when we were all November 7th, 1972, when George McGovern said, we can never pledge allegiance to policies that we can't endorse. And tears were streaming down my face, and I guess that was the first time I really realized that if you have your ideals and if you work with everything you've got, you're still not going to get what you want. So when that kind of sense of disappointment, right after that, within a year, one of my friends from the McGovern campaign said, we're thinking of meeting to start a rape crisis center. Will you come to that? Yeah. So we had all of this unhappy, dissatisfied energy. I mean, yeah, there were nice things, Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. That was good. But it was really symbolic. We still got this issue here of rape. We're not making much progress. We're getting a lot of resistance. But from there, with that dissatisfaction, progressive politics weren't bringing women's issues into the forefront. But we did. I remember asking city commissioners if they had ever battered their wives at a forum.
How'd that go over?
There was a lot of tension, and One of them, of course, had been a batterer, but it was the idea of being there, being in the audience, and being willing to
question out.
Bringing that question out was enough, yeah, to put the fear of the Almighty in these perps' eyes, because no one would have ever asked that question, because what does that have to do with politics and how you use your power? I suppose that would appear to be radical then. But, but you get that. But no, like this, how inappropriate. You don't want to slander anyone. Yeah, right.
So what about that? It seems like you talk about this, the retreat that you went to. Was it in Vermont?
It was a 40-day course. Women's Movement Training School was the feminist Sagaris.
It was Sagaris.
Yes, it was Sagaris. Was the first 40-day session. You had to, was taught by Rena Mae Brown, Charlotte Bunch, Mary Daly, Bertha Harris, Blanche Boyd, Joan Peters, Catherine Kilgore, Emily Medvig, Kitch Childs, people that I remember best. And the second session was T. Grace Atkinson, Susan Sherman, Alex Kate Schulman, and I don't remember who else, but I do remember that in March, before I even knew I was going to Sagaris, I had been to I had been to Tampa, and T. Grace Atkinson had spoken, and there was, to me, such a sadness in the room, the low affect. And this was a woman who was traumatized by assault, like women are, but I could sense that lack of vitality she had. I mean, to be a warrior, got to pull up the energy enough to be happy enough in taking the hits. I thought, I think if I have a choice of going first session or second session, I go to the first session because I couldn't see the hope in T. Grace's eyes. And that's not knocking her personally at all. I'm just saying people get worn out. So I did that. They were doing 2 sessions, and then there was, of course, FBI infiltration in them, and it hadn't been but within a couple of weeks of the second session that the whole place just blew up. That was, I don't even know if they completed the course, really.
I think they didn't. I think you're right. I'm hazy on the details, but my sense is that something really bad happened in that second session, and it just kind of dissolved.
Well, there were, like I said, there were infiltrators. I don't know what I was talking about, something. And somebody said, who is that woman? Isn't she from so-and-so? And she was trying to get information. You do it very subtly. I wanted to know where to place her geographically and her name. I thought, and that wasn't a regular person. I thought, oh yeah, I get that. That was there. And we also decided that it took more than the FBI to blow up a movement. We could do that ourselves with all of our hostilities, but somehow I think, T. Grace had brought up, there was issues about taking money from Kodak. Would that be cooperative? And other issues. But that blew up. And I think what that tells me is that the amplitude, if that's the word, is so high, the voltage is so high in social change that, when you get hit with all this electricity, how we can transform it and act I want to say responsibly, but with a degree of stably. And after Sagaris, and there was some, around the same time, red stockings, please. Whatever women are doing is not enough. We're not doing it either, but listen to us instead of whoever's doing something, because there's a reason to discredit anybody who's doing anything. Whether it's Susan Brown Miller, whether it's Gloria Steinem. Gloria Steinem worked for the CIA before she was a Playboy bunny. And as Rita May said, look at all these pamphlets, these very sophisticated, well-printed things that are being put out there. You think the women's movement's got that kind of money? She said, no, not even. This is the government. Who is funding this? And there would be, nice glossy tracts about, where was Gloria Steinem when blah, 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 blah. And who's paying for this? So those things were happening, and I was thinking, who is fanning the flames to discredit leaders? Just as J. Edgar Hoover did Martin Luther King. Who is doing that? Well, Rita May wrote a letter to Off Our Backs about Gloria Steinem and some of the conflicts around International Women's Year in Mexico City, and whether Gloria Steinem may have worked for the CIA. And she said, this is a woman, with whom I do not always agree, but who I always love and trust. Oh, that takes care of it. So if there's respect, we can deal with disagreement. But if there is disrespect, those are the same tools that will dismantle us. We can say, well, I don't like men. They act like they don't respect me. And they don't. But then we have to establish a higher standard of either or. Yes, no, right, wrong, smart, stupid. The false dichotomies that Mary Daly talked about. Beware of the false dichotomy, because nothing is ever either or. It's yes and, to beware of the ambiguity. And when we are aware of those things, then there's room for more inclusiveness and a dialogue. Anyway.
So the Red Stockings, though, they had a presence in Gainesville at the time. So is it safe did they? I guess they were in New York, but...
They were in New York. Judith Brown was a member of the Red Stockings. Susan Brown Miller went on to write Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape. Kathy Sarah Child and her work on consciousness raising was really important. My position is, if you aren't out there in the streets in this movement, what are you contributing? I don't want to hear what your theory is up in your ivory tower. When I want to know, how are you applying it to make life safer for women? Because that is changing everything. It's changing some of the concepts of the sanctity of the nuclear family. You want to get married and have kids. Well, but what if there is domestic violence? And if your kids are watching domestic violence, are you willing, in the name to save your marriage, to shape that pathological image for them to incorporate in their lives, where this is how we pass misery on? So I didn't get the radical, I didn't get the implementation of the Red Stockings. Yeah, it's nice to read it, but, show me the money. That's my position. When I came back from Sagaris, I organized a march against violence against women in August of, I came back in July. This would be August 26th, 1975, right after I had come back. And, now wanted to do those around the country. And that made sense to me. And I also said to a number of my friends, I said, we need to wear dresses to this. I said, why? I said, because the media will assume that this is not a middle class, that it's not a middle class issue. And it's got to be dressed up as a middle class issue. So we're going to wear our dresses and march through Gainesville. And there weren't other Red Stockings in Gainesville except Judith Brown, and she did join me. I'm adamant, unless we call attention to a social problem, it's not going to change. Theory's not going to fix this. So, it's to the barricades, Judith. So, and she did that. But otherwise, there were issues, having to try to explain why we needed battered women's shelters. Those did not come naturally for every red stocking. Like, huh? But then not everybody had the same experience. You know, if you've ever seen domestic violence, if you've ever experienced it, but, you know, there was not the integrity of the theory and the application. So, yeah, and I, you know, of course I've read the Red Stockings primer. Great, but, you know, it's like college. You can learn whatever you learn in college. Well, what are you going to do when you walk out the gate? And how are you going to apply it? Or what's the college for?
Right, so it seems like it's like this culture of violence really influenced your actions. And sort of the more, I'd really like to know what it was like in Gainesville, what you were up against. You know, you talked a little bit last time about people planting razor blades in your pots or having to walk around.
Yeah, in the flower pots,
in the flower pots, or having to walk around with a gun just to
right,
on your
someone
balcony.
trying to break into the house.
So what was that? What was that culture of violence that you were experiencing in Gainesville like? So,
well, there's a sense of danger because I wake up in the middle of the night and I open my eyes on a moonlit night and I look toward the window and I hear myself think, okay, here he comes. Sure enough, right at the window, there is this figure who's going to try to get in the window. And I don't know if it's appropriate for me to say what I said to him, but it was at high decibels, and it was very displeasing to his ears. And he fled. And then I had to think more. I thought, you know, I've got a 2-year-old, and if anybody kills Joan's mother, that's doing violence to my child, so I've got to rethink some of this. Now, rapists had called me before I joined the women's movement when I was in the suburbs. There was a guy who was a creep who would try to show up, a guy named Bobby Wright who raped a number of women. So it's not because of my feminism that this happened. No, we were all at risk anyway, and only 4% of cases were being prosecuted. Or maybe there was 4 getting a conviction, but, you know, it's not something people were talking about, and it's nothing that law enforcement was doing anything about. But then there was that responsibility. Well, I've got a 2-year-old. I guess I had better learn to shoot, and a friend of mine, Ross Thompson, loaned me his shotgun. And I also had some shooting lessons later, but my daughter said, Mommy, what would you do if somebody broke in and tried to hurt us? I said, well, I've asked myself that, Joan. I said, because I really wouldn't want to hurt anybody. But if someone broke in and tried to hurt us, I would try to stop him, and I would do that probably by shooting him. That's what I would do. With what? I said, with a gun. I have a shotgun, and given that she was 2, and it was the attic was way up there, and she couldn't get to it, I may have showed it to her. And she said, good for you, Mommy. I mean, is this child picking up on the tensions of self-preservation? Everyone wants to self-preserve, including kids. Yeah, we're all in danger as children. Girl children more so than boy children, but boy children too. The world ain't safe for babies. And since feminism, the world is a little more safe for babies, but we haven't had the kind of radical change that I was hoping we would have by now. But you cannot solve a social problem until you have named it. And we have named it, and there is a name for that. And there can't be social disapproval for inappropriate behavior unless there is a language for social disapproval. And we've done those things. And that, creating language, and when I was in middle school, there was a textbook called English in Action, and we have been language in action.
Well, following up on that, Sallie, we had talked before about the creation of a sort of, I think you called it a sort of underground railroad for getting children away from their predatory fathers because of the lack of belief in childhood sexual abuse and the need to create a safe corridor for women to get their children away from their predators. Could you talk a little bit about that?
What I would say is not a lack of belief, but patriarchy. The good old boy system is the good old boy system. And the belief, my friend Ross Thompson was talking to me, he is from Georgia, and we were talking about the situation. I said, Ross, it's a civil rights issue for men. I said, the white man has really had a rough time. He's losing ground. He can't beat his wife without getting into trouble with domestic violence legislation that's been introduced. So really, all that's left that he can do is have dominion over his child. And Ross said, yes, you're right, Sallie. This is a sexual issue for men. It's an issue of rights for men. I mean, if a man can't rape his own child, who can he rape? Oh, God, Ross, I wouldn't. You are putting it in those graphic terms, but it's true. This is a matter of property. This is a matter of property, and that's the huge power struggle, which will continue. I was not involved in an underground railroad for sexually abused kids. I was involved with an underground for women who had suffered domestic violence because they'd be killed by their husbands. I got that. So one woman I knew had a Fulbright scholarship. She's going away for the summer. I said, could we use your apartment here in Gainesville to house people? She said, sure. So we did those things. Around the country, people realized that the government was not our friend, that the police represented patriarchal power. A friend who had been battered by her husband, had her 2-year-old, she's bloody. Cops come to the door and says, the Bible says, subject yourself to your husband just as Christ died on the cross, or whatever they were saying. And they said, if you leave, you have to leave the baby with him. So that was the way it was then. Now, we have a pro-arrest policy in Gainesville, primarily thanks to the Commission on the Status of Women and Lenore Walker. But now, if a cop goes to the door in Gainesville and sees the bloody nose or the scratches and bruises, that is probable cause right then to make an arrest. and there's more accountability than there ever was here now. It's progress, but there's still the culture that men have a right to use women as a punching bag. So that still exists. And the radical part has to do with roles of men and women. I mean, I don't know that this should even be on tape, but in thinking about this, this pilot who burned his house down and then flies his plane into the 9-story building where the IRS is housed in Texas. You know, I am furious. People consider him a hero. If he was Islamic, he's a terrorist. He's a white man, he's a hero. The worst part of it is the man that we know that he killed was an African-American male, a veteran who had signed up to go to Vietnam twice. That was the real hero, but he is invisible, just like a woman. He does not count. And what I'm saying about that is, what is it in men where they need to express their power? They have been emasculated unless they can express violence. That's the radical part that we have to challenge. You know, why is that? And it's, oh, it was so nice. And the daughter said, you know, my father was a hero. Later, when she realized that he had killed a Vietnam veteran who was just chopped liver, she did take that back. But, you know, what does it mean to be a man? This is why so many black men are in prison. As I said to my son-in-law, who was in the most restrictive environment, you know, what does it mean to be a man? And what does it mean to be a black man? And how can you be a man, a black man, without being in prison? Do you have to fight other men to defend your honor? You know, in Islamic culture, men will kill their 13-year-old daughters who are buried alive for speaking to boys, because they have to defend their own honor. They don't want other men talking about them. You know, what are the messages that we are giving as a culture about how we express our gender? Now, those are some concerns that I have. But since you brought it up, that's something I've been mulling over. Particularly, I'm raising 4 grandsons, and you know, my adopted son is a little bit better off. But you know, how do you raise kids to say, what does it mean to be a man, as well as what does it mean to be a woman now, and which is very different from femininity.
Right. So when you think about that, femininity and defining what it means to be a woman in Gainesville, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, there seemed to be sort of this active, I don't know, kind of shift or movement of ideas about how to define that. And a part of that seemed to have been sexuality, right? Who you sleep with, your politics, being connected to that. And so I know you were talking in one part about the threat that lesbians and witches pose to sort of the social order. This was last time. But how did that factor in?
Threat.
And especially if there are sort of examples about Gainesville or reactions to people, to you or to other people. Like, how did sexuality, the threat that a woman's sexuality had, or could pose, how did that factor into all of this equation?
Oh, it's pervasive, of course. You know, if I go to a meeting at my child's school, not my daughter's regular teacher, another teacher says, well, Joan is just having a hard time, and I think it's because you're gay. So, well, tell me about that, and tell me how you think that's playing out, I said, and of course, sexuality on a continuum, my identity is really different from my behavior. I don't say that to her, but I said, tell me about that. And I know she is somehow wanting to put me on the defensive. I said, I see her functioning really well. I don't see my sexuality as an issue. I know this may be something that's really charged for you, and I hope you don't bring it into the classroom, but, there are counselors and other people you could talk to. And that's really, that's what you got to do. It is also important, again, if you want to shape social behavior, to march with your dresses on, to have a tidy press release, you wouldn't write it in menstrual blood. There's impersonate some kind of a mainstream, a modicum of common sense, and not for show, for people to show how radical they are. It will become more apparent just by living how radical you are. But there are people who wanted to be more attention-getting. And that is appropriate under some circumstances, but if it's ego and it's not political, then that doesn't help. So the question, again, was how do we integrate being radical or being sexually out of bounds, being in the Gainesville culture?
Yeah, so in Gainesville, not how did that work, but in a way, how did that play out in your marching for women's rights or for violence against women, and someone could picket against you and say, oh, they're just a bunch of witches and lesbians, and so
I don't think we
that.
weren't even ambitious enough to be called witches then, I say to my embarrassment, but we were well-meaning. When I was going through my divorce, Inez Garcia had been raped in California, and this is like 1974, and she went after her two rapists with a gun and killed them. And so I had organized a Free Inez Garcia rally, and I think I was holding my child, and someone gave me the microphone, which I did not ask for because I was going through a divorce. And I was on television, and the judge in my court case was awful. He was really hostile, and he refused to give me a restraining order, though the neighbors had said, they had seen my husband hit me and tear my blouse off. But no, I couldn't get a restraining order, and we both had to live in the same house. And I was afraid that I was going to lose custody of my child. I would be asked, don't you go to a meeting of the Rape Crisis Center every week? Yes. Aren't you a member of the National Organization for Women? Yes. So, of course, there was that persecution. We don't like what we don't understand, and being cutting edge means you're going to be right out there. And you have to be holy to live outside the law, and that's the law of social behavior. And the fact is, I was an honorable parent, I was an honorable worker, I'm not sitting out in some field smoking pot, letting my kids skip school. You know, I was towing the line, you know, in the quest for social change. I wasn't willing to be labeled marginal, and that's why it's important to be willing to go to a press conference and address sometimes. Ladies, no, Women for Decency, when we did that one. You know, a visiting economics professor, this is 1978, Ezra Mashan. His scam was he put an ad in the Alligator because he wanted models to sculpt. Well, he didn't want models. You know, he wanted to cop a feel and he wanted to get laid. And so the women would take off their clothes, and there were 21 counts of sexual battery against him. And, you know, UF is all but, you know, singing hosannas and waving palm fronds to him because they think he is the most marvelous thing in Western civilization. So we had to march, demonstrate and organize a march around that. There's always work that has to be done. You just have to raise hell. I don't know whether that answered the questions or not, but that's, yeah, you have to be out there, you know, at the university raising hell and identifying those issues with signs and making noise. Because, you know, to maintain the status quo, you need denial and you need minimization. And particularly if we can appear more mainstream, you don't have to, but what matters is not shutting up, no matter what, not shutting up. I did a lot of guerrilla theater in those days, which is what it was, you know, we called ourselves Women for Decency. And I remember saying to the press in my dress, maybe with a hat, if this is art, then we don't want it in Gainesville. And and I'd call for a boycott of the Sun Gallery and the Sun Bank because they were the Sun Gallery was putting on this exhibition of his, which was a ruse to make it look like he's a serious sculptor. And our press conference was at 12 o'clock, and his exhibit was supposed to open at 1, and it was closed. And then later, Larry Turner showed that film of me, you know, if this is art, then we don't want it in Gainesville, as reason to get a change of venue, and he was successful. But yeah, anyway, I don't know if that explains anything or not.
Excuse me, we got about 2 more minutes on this tape.
I'm not sure I know what you're asking, how it played out. Could you give me some more nouns?
Sure. I kind of just want to get a sense for maybe if there were particular moments like establishing the Rape Crisis Center or establishing the Gainesville Women's Health Center or, you know, any kind of thing that might have caused a reaction and what that reaction was.
When there wasn't, okay, Rape Crisis Center. Once over here on campus at the radio station, you know, I crawled out on some cold night to be interviewed about domestic violence. This is early on, spouse abuse. And the police officer who is there, I will not mention his name, he died not too long ago, he said, what? He said, you think we got to go into somebody's house and arrest some man because we don't know what he's done to provoke his wife? He said, and just because a man is beating the door down, you know, that doesn't mean that somebody is necessarily going to be hurt. I said, well, if somebody is beating my door down and breaking my lock, I'm going to believe that they're not there to bring me roses and chocolates. And he's mad, but these are the kind of things we'd get from police on a continuum. They were having trouble. They didn't want to, because, it's also part of the culture. Policemen were certainly batterers, just as so many segments of the culture was at that time. So that was a threat. Now, the Gainesville Women's Health Center, on the day they opened their doors in April of 1974, my friend Abby had a friend who lived in her collective, Weird Leonard. And I said, why don't we walk over to the Gainesville Women's Health Center? I want to go there for their grand opening. And so it's a nice tea and social kind of thing, and there may be champagne punch, something like that. It's pleasant. And there's a tour of the facility. They said, this is this, and this is the procedure room. Well, as we're going back down the hall, Weird Leonard, who was not the sharpest tool in the shed, the lights went off in his head, and he said, procedure room. This is a goddamn abortion mill. I said, and Leonard, there's one more thing I want to show you. And he said, what's that? And I shove him through the door and lock it. And I said, the door. and locked him out of the open house. There were always those resistances. I mean, nobody took this laying down on either side. There were always resistance from Gene Keith. I think that minister had a lot to do with, and Lois Ann O'Malley and Right to Life. There were always a resistance, abortion and murder. And I didn't understand totally why there was such hysteria about abortion, but I understand now that if you cannot control a woman's reproduction, you really can't control that woman. That's a whole issue you can't have dominion over. If you cannot colonize a woman and force her into having as many children as you rape her to have or make her have, I mean, you don't have to rape either. You can say, this is what you're going to do. I'm not going to support you. I won't feed the kids we've got. I now see the seriousness of abortion. I knew it was important then, but I didn't get how radical it was. If you do not have to carry any zygote to term, then that upsets the world order of most established churches, or mosques particularly, or temples, so it's big. So yeah, of course there was tremendous upheaval. There were a couple of fires at the Gainesville Women's Health Center. When we were marching, there'd be threats of violence, and even with the Equal Rights Amendment marches, there's a lot of friction with the joie de vivre that one's got to have to be the political warrior. There was the resistance and the hostility. For every action there was at least an equal and opposite reaction, and then some. And then you have to decide, what am I doing and why am I doing this? And how committed am I to doing this? Well, and particularly in my case, it doesn't sound really radical, but because I had a daughter, and I thought, how is the world going to be any safer for her? I thought that was my responsibility to pursue some of those things, even when I did not have a philosophy and an ideology.
When you talk about sort of the women, you talk about the women involved in these movements, in these marches, in these centers. Sort of, you discuss it as a collective we. Were there people who was it always the same people? Was it a changing group of people? Were they
Always changing.
And you were involved with all of them? And so how did that?
Well, we get involved. I mean, I wasn't sexually involved.
No,
I mean, I always wanted to work. I really was interested in the movement. I was not interested in having more personal drama in my life than I had to have. I mean, it was enough to try to do Joan, the school, radical ravings, the job, and, you know, whatever kind of legal opportunities.
Would you say that there were many people in the movement for whom the opportunities for increased personal drama was a big draw?
I don't know the big draw, but I think as human beings, okay, one friend of mine was very attractive, and I would see women who were married, like to county commissioners, who would be flirting with her and coming on to her. And I think, you know, all of us are human beings who have a sensual, erotic component. And a person who is powerful and healthy and whole in her sense of personal power is very attractive. And everyone is a sexual being. I think when Nikki Giovanni was here a number of years ago, she said, I don't care what you say. You pick any two people out, and you put them in a room long enough, there's going to be sex. You pick any one person out and put them in a room long enough, there's going to be sex. So I thought, oh, I think she's right. But I didn't want, you know, with my Libra idealism, I didn't want my movement mucked up with sexual politics. But that's, you know, that's the world. I mean, sexuality will happen anywhere, but.
Right, so not speaking sexually involvement, but political involvement. So these women that were a part of the movement.
Oh yeah, you've got people who've been at the university for years and passed over because they didn't get the promotions that they deserved. You know, you've got people who had one woman, she and her daughter had both been raped and held at gunpoint. And for them, yeah, they had done therapy and all those things, but working in the Rape Crisis Center and doing education, and I think going to the jail and meeting with their rapist was the work they needed to do to confront that and turn that around.
Is facilitating that kind of encounter, is that something that the Rape Crisis Center did to bring about that confrontation?
We were young and naive, and she was a bit older than we were. This particular, she's a woman, she's a teacher, and her daughter was a little younger. But she, from the knowledge she got, she said she wanted to do that. And we supported that, may have worked a little bit with the jail for that to happen. And that's, for her daughter, that was especially important. But
that wasn't a common practice, something that you saw to encourage people to do.
None of it was common. It was uncommon, but I thought this is possible. This is possible. I mean, you know, how do you confront and how do you change behavior? We have to say, this is what has been, you know, you have to look at me not as a thing, but as a person. And this is the harm that you have caused. We have to use our voices and to talk about that, to say things that we don't like to say.
Yeah, to put
the human face on it,
and make it part of language.
Yes. Does that explain some of it? I mean, it's hard to give the different pieces, but for everything we did, there was a reaction, and lots of threats.
Who are the we? So how many, obviously this is a changing group, but maybe there was a core that you've been here for a long time and there's other people involved.
Let's look at the Equal Rights Amendment, because there'd be large marches for the Equal Rights Amendment in Gainesville and statewide marches on Tallahassee. Well, there were thousands of people when Marlowe, Thomas, and Alan Alda came in 75. That was a very huge ERA march. So you had, tens of thousands of people. The ERA marches and runs in Gainesville were very, very large, as well they should have been. You had the women's bookstore, Women Unlimited involved, the Rape Crisis Center.
The Gainesville Commission.
the Gainesville.
By that time.
Pardon?
By that time, they would have been involved.
Yes, and the Gainesville Women's Health Center, and the League of Women Voters. I mean, Alice McAdam organized a coalition of people in the area of domestic violence. It was Alice, who we paid to be our first now lobbyist, who put the tax on the marriage license to fund the rape crisis centers.
And she was with the League?
No, the League supported her, but she organized the ERA coalition. She was with now, she'd run for president of UF as well. So we're looking for solutions. Yeah, if we were going to have shelters for battered women, how are we going to fund them? With the marriage license. That was brilliant. So, and it had to be a coalition. Any woman who thought or her mother, her sister, her daughter was going to be discounted in the workplace would get on board. And as Rita May had said at Sagaris, rape is a huge organizing tool because people will take actions for their safety when other issues they won't be as passionate about. But, rape is self-preservation. So, you had, and I was president of the Alachua County Women's Political Caucus for a while, and we would have soirees for all the political candidates, and they would have to discuss where they were on women's issues. That was big. That had several hundred members.
This is a larger question, but mentioning the caucus sparks that. If we wanted to get a list of those several hundred members, the minutes from meetings, things like that, have you got those records? Does somebody have them? Where can we find that? Because your memory, as great as it is imperfect, and it would be great to have paper records of that organization.
I saw some membership for GWEAR, Gainesville Women for Equal Rights. I saw old membership mailing list. I don't know what happened to the Alachua Women's Political Caucus records. May have been the last. I think I was the last president of that, but I don't know if all these folders have been transferred to me. I don't.
So that stuff's kicking around in people's garages somewhere, maybe.
Polly Dowdy might know.
No.
Yeah,
Okay.
Polly Dowdy.
Because one of the things we're hoping to do in the long term, in addition to doing interviews like this, is to find those paper records so that we have a physical, searchable archive of this history. So we know these organizations, so we know how they work together, and we're trying to figure out ways to find that stuff. How do you think we can do that? Other than calling Polly Dowdy.
Calling Polly Dowdy, and the next thing I would say is what I've said for 36 or 7 years. Call Rosalie. Janice Mara, used to be so intimidated by Rosalie's political power, she would sing, "The old gray mare, she ain't what she used to be. Let's go find Rosalie." But Rosalie's going to move back to Gainesville.
Oh,
Yeah, but she was here last weekend. Mickey Salcedo has the archives for lesbian archives, and what all she has, I don't know. I know I gave her a bunch of T-shirts from the Mother's Day March for ERA and some other things.
how do you spell her last name? I've seen it spelled a bunch of different ways.
I think it is
S-A-U?
Saucedo. I
Okay.
think that is correct. And Connie Jalanke may be able to help us with that too. Yeah, because I was talking to Rosalie about that and this last weekend. And I hope she could come down for the panel
On the 8th.
on the 8th, I'm hoping. But, you know, the
should make
movement is the reason she's coming back to Gainesville. So I've got to get back to my people. Mm-hmm. I said, yeah, I mean, we've got to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed before we kick the bucket.
I'm going to have to go in just a second for my office hours, but Jessica, you can keep the tape running if you want to do that.
Yeah, I guess I only have like one last sort of theme I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, help me, because I'm sorry that I'm missing some of what you're trying to communicate.
It's my brain.
All right.
I guess what I'd like to know is when you're developing all these ideas, what's really fascinating to me when I think about the feminist movement is that this is really sort of the nexus. Gainesville is one of the places where all these ideas are coming about. And I wanted to ask you what were the connections between Gainesville and other movements? So what's going on in New York or what's going on in Washington? And what were some other maybe connections with international movements? Like, were you reading the French feminists of the time, like Irigaray, or were you connected in some ways just with ideas? Like, how did these ideas all happen? Because when consciousness-raising groups are happening in Gainesville, they're also happening in New York. So, that's just one example.
Well, it was spontaneous combustion. Yeah, this was happening everywhere. It was so organic. Yeah, you're right. The consciousness-raising groups now was a good structure for that. Because if you have a now chapter in a town, disaffected housewives or young students can join that. But there was a women's consciousness, and some men's were being changed, but it wasn't specifically, I remember when Susan Brownmill's book came out, but it's like a popcorn popper. It's all going off at the same time.
Mm. So you read Susan Brownmiller and
I read, and Del Martin and Phyllis Lyons. They had done one of the first books about battered women, and certainly, the sisterhood is powerful. Primer that Robin Morgan wrote, and I became good friends with a woman who wrote under the name, this would be many years later, of Ellen Strong, about the politics of prostitution. I was a very, middle-class, naive person. There's a lot I didn't understand. And Judy Cypher's article, I Want a Wife, that ends with, my God, who wouldn't want a wife? So that, everybody read Sisterhood is Powerful. That primer changed a number of people. And the expression, every woman is one man away from welfare. Sisterhood is Powerful was one radical book.
So was there correspondence? Let's say you're sponsoring a march and you want to sort of have a sense of how they did things in another group. Was there a sense of interconnectedness between these movements, or were they really local?
For International Women's Year, there would be meetings around in each state. I think Phyllis Schlafly called it a free lunch for Bella's bunch. Free lunch for Bella's bunch. And there would be resolutions about what women want. There would be, health care, reproductive freedom, and a few other things. But this had to be all done in 1977. I think that was the International Year of the Woman. And that was very coordinated because busloads of Mormons were coming in to disrupt every one of these meetings. And there would be rows and violent fracases, when you've got a large evangelist who is shoving a black woman with his big stomach. I mean, and, knocking people out of the way. They were really very angry men and women. The anti-ERA women, extremely angry. So, we worked very closely because who would have thought it could be dangerous? But it was so dangerous, I remember saying, I'm glad I didn't bring my child. I never thought I would be someplace that my child wouldn't be safe. I mean, in what should be a middle-class setting, but it was really dangerous. Somebody called the White House, and we joined hands. There was this minister and some other people who were anti-ERA and very loud and disruptive. We joined hands and sang and danced around them and wouldn't let them out. And
this was at the state meeting?
There had to be hearings in every.
But this isn't at the conference in Houston itself.
No, because there had to be a state meeting. This was the state conference.
So
there had to be a state
platform.
Yes, there had to be a state conference. I was one of the presenters for that. Well, they called Jimmy Carter at the White House, and I think Polly Dowdy had to try to explain what we were doing or something. There's a lot of hysteria. It's the Mormon Church. That's when Sonia Johnson was excommunicated for working for the ERA.
So that was a moment of national cooperation.
That demanded that connectedness. I mean, we did the cooperation with Inez Garcia, with Women Against Violence, with Take Back the Night. We would all do things, but there wasn't a script because every community is different. What makes Gainesville different from other cities is the real sense of joie de vivre. As Nancy Breeze said, she had been a lobbyist for zero population growth in the Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights in D.C. When she moved to Gainesville, she said, I had no idea that the women's movement had such a sense of humor because, we were happy warriors. The humor, women for decency. We wanted to have a good time. We were going to dance. It was going to be our revolution. And it's easier in some respects to have that kind of joie de vivre, especially in the South, because the South likes color, likes pageantry, likes theater.
Were you in tune with the women's movement in the rest of the world? Like, were you aware of, let's say, pro-abortion campaigns that were happening in different parts of the world?
Yes, I mean, I traveled a little bit, and there was an abortion initiative in Spain when I was there later in '83. I think Judith Brown had stayed in touch with Simone de Beauvoir, but Rosalie was at her memorial in New York. And things that different people were doing, as Ursula Le Guin, I mean, anything, Mary Daly, all of those things, there's so many books about feminist culture. It's everywhere. If I went someplace, I could usually find another feminist to talk to. I met a woman, Genevieve, when I was in Paris. And I stayed with women from the Rape Crisis Center when I went to D.C., and we're friends. And Mary Alice and her husband, Jerry, we're friends, to this day. When we went to D.C. to find out what they were doing for their Rape Crisis Center, they were called FAR, Feminist...
Against rape?
Against Feminist Alliance, I think, against rape. I think that was it. Yeah, so we wanted to find out what other people were doing. And there was always working. We were going to do ERA stuff, and we were writing songs for the ERA march for Tallahassee, home behind the range where once women toiled all day, and seldom was heard an encouraging word, but that was before ERA. Real achievable objectives we had then. But that's part of the idealism of youth.
So is there anything we missed? Any other topic you want to bring up? Anything that...
It doesn't come right now. The way we treat ourselves, the way we raise our children, the way we respect the men and the women that we love, the way we treat our mothers differently. I mean, we live in a world that disrespects mothers. So a lot of women, are really close to their fathers, and they don't like their mothers because their mothers act the way they were socialized to act. So we have to be different and not be elitist in seeing the values of our mothers. The most important thing any of us has is our voice, and our voice and our gut, and when we feel that tightness and the squeeze in our gut, there's something threatening. If we can connect that with our voice and speak out about it, that is what changes the world. And it's very frightening and fun.
Mm-hmm.
There.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sallie.
Yeah, I mean, this is as much as, I don't know that, it's hard to put a dent in what all there is to be